Greetings, everybody. I'm Julie Wiskirchen from the authors team in Santa Monica, and it's an honor today for us to welcome John Dean to our program. He served as the counsel to the president under Richard Nixon. Over the years, he's become one of the nation's most respected political commentators, and he's written extensively on law, government, and politics. Before becoming White House counsel in July 1970, at age 31, he was Chief Minority Counsel to the Judiciary Committee of the United States House of Representatives, the Associate Director of a Law Reform Commission, and Associate Deputy Attorney General of the United States. He served as Nixon's White House lawyer for 1,000 days. John's the author of 10 nonfiction works. His most recent New York Times best-selling books include Worse Than Watergate, Conservatives Without Conscience, and Broken Government: How Republican Rule Destroyed the Legislative, Executive, and Judicial Branches. Today he's going to talk about his reissue of Blind Ambition, which originally spent 6 months on the New York Times bestseller list. So please join me in welcoming John Dean.
Thank you, Freddie. I've got to tell you people in particular, and you will certainly understand, how Google has changed the life of authors. As somebody who uses a lot of databases, for example, LexisNexis and Westlaw and bases like that over the years, it is a delight to see the influence you're having on them to move on from Boolean searches to actual natural language searches, and you're slowly pulling the rest of the database community along. But you know, I'm not sure that I could do the work as fast as I do it and as thoroughly as I do it without Google. So it's a delight for me to be down here. I don't know if some of your other authors have had a chance to talk about that or not, but it is becoming an essential tool. I don't use a research assistant because I think that's part of the pleasure of being an author, is doing the research. And for a number of years, first of all, I wrote Blind Ambition, which we're going to talk about today, and another book called Lost Honor, right after I left the White House. And then I went into business, private investment banking for several decades, and was very active in business, and then promised myself I would come back out when I was 60 and start writing, which I've done. And when I first started, there was really not even a very good graphic interface on the internet. And as you all know, what has happened in the last decade and a half, 2 decades, has really revolutionized it. I'm not sure I could produce a book a year, as I have been doing, without your tools and that access to data. I'm waiting, though, for the next phase when you eliminate the author by just posing the question and saying, I like this from the right or the left or the center view or what have you. And the same is true with, I've been online as a writer, not only of books, but as a columnist, and it's very helpful in that regard. And coming down here today, I was thinking what to talk about, and this has been a rough couple days for our city. We've lost somebody who happened to be a friend of mine, Ed McMahon. We've lost Farrah Fawcett, whose work I certainly enjoyed and admired and watched the struggle she went through. And then, of course, yesterday, Lizzie Michael Jackson is a real surprise. So it's been kind of a bad time. And I've been doing a lot of lectures lately on a subject that troubles me deeply, is torture. And I said, well, that isn't maybe necessarily the right subject to follow after what this city's been through. And happened to be last night in sort of old Hollywood. I was in an event there to talk to a number of people about, it's called a Great Minds series, which I'd done a number of times. These are all sort of pre-publication for bringing this book out. It's actually a special edition we put together. They're sort of collector's copies because there are only 1,000 of them printed before they actually get to the bookstores, to give you a preview of what is coming. So anyway, last night I was thinking about it, and I thought maybe I ought to turn, since these were very interesting people we've lost, to the subject of love. And the first love that came to mind is kind of a unique situation we have with Mark Sanford, the governor of South Carolina, whose emails have surfaced on the internet with his enmity with a woman in Argentina. I wrote my column for today on that subject because I have a little different take than most people on it. And an issue that struck me was the fact that why didn't the governor or his mistress, who were clearly tipped off to this long before they surfaced. They surfaced, as you know, in the last 48 hours, but before that, months earlier in December, apparently they were anonymously leaked to the South Carolina newspaper to tip them off. They had a number of these, could be they emailed the woman who was the subject, who has both sent them and who was Sanford's lover. So she clearly knew. She didn't respond, however, but she surely told the governor. So they had to know that there was this ticking time bomb. And what occurred to me is, why did he not exercise his copyright in those letters? And I was particularly aware of that copyright from a situation that had come up some years earlier when I wrote a book about one of our most maligned presidents, who happened to be from the same town I had grown up in, Marion, Ohio. Warren G. Harding, who is sometimes ranked as the worst president we have, which I find grossly unfair. Not for any partisan reason, but just sort of for historical reasons. And when doing research on a Harding book for the late Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the historian, who did a series of books on all 42, at that time, past presidents, I'd known Arthur for years, so I called him and I said, Arthur, I suspect you're not quite sure who to assign the Harding book to. And I said, I know I shouldn't talk to you about the Nixon book, but I would like to talk to you about the Harding book, because he was my first president. He was the founder and editor of the local newspaper, the Marion Star. It became a very successful paper, made Harding a very wealthy man. And the editor of the paper happened to have been my next door neighbor when I grew up. And Jack Maxwell would give me books about Warren Harding. So he was my first president. And 13, 14 years of age, I started reading about this man. And over the years, really accumulated a very vast library on Harding, where I knew that a lot of information had been put out on him that was really not very accurate. So I called Arthur and I said, I think I'd like to do that. In doing the book, I ran into something very interesting. That Harding, this was rumored in town, that he had a mistress. And one was clear. Another one, a second mistress from the same town, was not quite so clear. A woman by the name of Nan Britton in 1923, about 27, I guess it was, when she wrote a book called The President's Daughter, claiming that she had the illegitimate child of Harding. And the book was something of a sensation and begins the disintegration of Harding's reputation, if you will. I had always had doubts. Everybody who lived in Marion had doubts that Nan Britton had this relationship. We did know, however, that he did have a relationship with a woman by the name of Carrie Phillips. Well, to make a long story short, Carrie, I knew Carrie because you'd always hear on the local radio station that looking at the dogs in the audience made me think of this. Carrie's dogs, her German shepherds, were constantly getting lost. So she had a pack of them, and so they would come on the local radio, if anybody's seen Carrie's dogs, please report, she's looking for them. But anyway, when the Harding papers were finally released in 1964, about this time, a researcher also came to Marion, tracking down the rumor, somebody who was really trying to further denigrate Harding's reputation, to see about Carrie Phillips, and discovered that Carrie had actually kept a shoebox full of love letters from Warren Harding. They had been turned over to her attorney. The attorney showed this researcher and they then surfaced. The family quickly moved, and under their inherited copyright power, suppressed the Harding letters. They settled the lawsuit. The letters were sent to the Library of Congress, where they remained sealed until 2014. So we're getting close. But something unique happened. The person who had the letters at one time in the Ohio Historical Association actually microfilmed the letters. And it slipped outside of the settlement agreement, and this collection of the microfilm copy of the letters ended up in an Ohio Historical or Western Reserve Historical Society, and a friend of mine became aware of them. A friend who happens to be a very successful practicing attorney. He's a big litigation attorney who is also a serious student of Ohio history and politics. And he asked me if I wanted to see them, and I said, sure. I happened to be out there, and I said, these are fascinating. What a book this would make. And he looked at, being an attorney, he looked at it and realized the copyright had expired on them. They were outside the settlement. And so he, in turn, would get a hold of the Harding family. As a result of my doing my book, which was very fair to Harding, I had a good rapport with the family, and set it up so that he could talk to them, to tell him that his real interest, after he looked at a few of these letters, was not to sensationalize them, but to look to see what was actually in them. Well, as fate would have it, my friend happens to be in town. He was in a mediation all day yesterday with his partner out here trying to settle a lawsuit. And so I brought him with me last night, and I said, why don't you give my crowd last night 5 minutes about what this forthcoming book is. It's called The Harding Affair. I just did the foreword to it. It's called The Harding Affair, Love, Espionage During the Great War, by James David Robinall, with a foreword by yours truly. So I'm going to interrupt my session before we get down back into the Sanford emails, in case any of you ever think of writing your lover's emails and what you might do about them, and let Jim share with you what I think you're going to find a fascinating book. Oh, there's a mic out there, Jim. So, yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. This whole thing came to light.
I think you'll be on camera if you come up here. So
this whole thing came to light in 2004 when Dick Cheney and John Edwards debated in the vice presidential debate in Cleveland, Ohio. And I put together a symposium on Ohio and the presidency. Some of you may know that Ohio was the birthplace of a lot of presidents, 8 presidents at one time. So John, being an author, I asked him to come out, and I went to the Western Reserve Historical Society, which is a very good historical society in Cleveland, and said, do you have anything that would be of interest to Mr. Dean on Harding? And the guy said, I can't tell you on the phone. You got to come see me. I can't write you an email. I go to his office. He takes me back into his office. He puts a box on the table, and he pulls out this microfilm. And he said, do you know who Kenneth Duckett is? And I said, the name sounds familiar to me, but I'm not sure. And he said, well, this was the archivist who actually made a microfilm of all of these letters, and this is it. He just gave us all of his papers, and lo and behold, these letters that were supposed to be under seal, this was a bootleg copy of it. So we went back to the machine, we put it on the machine, and the first image that comes up is a photograph of Harding, who was a very good-looking man. And on the back of it, it's dated Christmas Eve, 1910, and it starts, my darling, there are no words to express my love for you. And it goes from there. Well, this thing, there are 900 pages of letters. Some of these love letters are 40 pages long. And it's a relationship that started in 1905. It was a neighbor of his. It started, I think, as, it really mimics all of these relationships. If you look at what Sanford wrote, I think it started very innocently and became more serious over time. But it lasted for 15 years. And he wrote very effusive love letters to her. And some of them are absolutely beautiful statements of the meaning of love and his love for her. And some are very graphic. You don't think of somebody in 1910 writing about body parts and things like that. It's all in the book. And so, you know, our first thought was, well, what historical value is this? And is this something that should be written about, or is it really a private affair? Back to this whole copyright question and privacy questions, people's personal life. We've obviously been through that with President Clinton, and I think most people in this room, if I ask you, was that anybody's business, everybody'd say, no, really. But in any event, we looked at it, and as we started to look further and further, what we found was there was a theme in her letters about Germany, pro-Germany. World War I comes into existence during the time of this relationship. Warren Harding becomes a United States Senator in 1914. She had just been in Germany for 3 years, taking her daughter there to be educated. She comes back just as the war starts. Well, lo and behold, what we discovered and what is in this book, she became a German spy during the First World War. And so these letters, you look at them, you think they're just about a love story, but in fact, they're about espionage in the United States. They're about why did people get involved in the First World War? Why did the United States get involved in the First World War? And then, you know, that war then has the impact for the next 100 years. And what does it all mean? So it has a much bigger meaning than just the love story. And I say we did this because every time I would discover something, I would call John, you're not gonna believe this. And we would talk it through, and he actually helped me put this together. We originally thought about writing it together, but his schedule's so busy he couldn't do it. So in any event, it's a great story, it's a great read. I think you'll find it fascinating. It really is about love, espionage, war, and ultimately the presidency of the United States. So it's quite an interesting book. It's coming out in September, and I hope you all buy it and read it.
Thanks, Jim. I've just got to put a footnote on that and say that what Jim's interest in this book in particular, what the letters revealed, were the character of Warren Harding, which has been much maligned over the years. It shows that when Kerry is really putting the pressure on Senator Harding to try to get him to be sympathetic with the Germans, that he puts country first every time, and knows she's going to at some point maybe even extort him to blow the love affair up in his face, to cost him his political career, but he consistently does the right thing, which was kind of nice and satisfying, because this isn't the image that Harding has. And as I once said somewhat facetiously to Jim, when you're responsible for bringing one president down, maybe you got to help bring another one up. Which is a good transition to the book you have in front of you. And I appreciate the fact that you have copies. It is a pre-publication copy. The book won't be in stores until probably the middle of next month. There's some formatting issues in it. The typeset's a little larger than it will finally be. But I wanted to get something out because a number of events have been scheduled, and I thought this was a good time to talk about it. I had had requests over the years to reissue this book from a number of publishers. I decided not to do so because I didn't really have anything to add to it. In 1991, however, a book was released called Silent Coup that claimed that I was the central cause and leading figure in Watergate, that I had actually ordered the Watergate break-ins, that I had then manipulated Richard Nixon into covering them up. I had duped everybody. I had fooled the FBI, the special prosecutor, the Senate Watergate Committee, the House impeachment inquiry, hundreds of historians and thousands of journalists. But I had not fooled a retired liquor salesman in Tampa, Florida, with very limited education, but lots of conspiracy theories. And so he indeed had unraveled the true facts. When the book was published, when he actually found a publisher for his preposterous account, I had nothing to do, but I had to come out and react. Hadn't thought about Watergate in years, didn't really want to think about it, wanted to leave it in the past, but I found I had no choice because one of his quiet collaborators became a less than quiet collaborator, and that was G. Gordon Liddy, who you may or may not know. We'll come back to that. Anyway, the reason I ordered the Watergate break-ins and then manipulated the Nixon White House, according to Silent Coup, was because my wife had a purported relationship with a call girl ring that was operating in the Democratic National Committee headquarters where the Watergate break-ins occurred. I quickly, when the book came out, got a hold of somebody who knew almost everybody in the Democratic National Committee, and not a soul had ever heard of this. In fact, one of the men that was spoken to said, "Hey, if there had been a call girl ring, I would have been the biggest customer, and this isn't something I would have ever missed." I had forewarned St. Martin's Press when I got wind of this from Mike Wallace that this book was coming down. Wallace and 60 Minutes were the people who alerted me to it. They thought it was rather a major story. They told me that Time magazine was going to excerpt it and treat it as major news. To make that story very short, both withdrew, giving me great respect for both 60 Minutes and Time magazine. Time magazine withdrawing their story after they had gone to press on a Friday night and finding a substitute material, but totally pulling it, realizing this was bogus history. I asked for a copy from Mike Wallace. He told me, "We can't give it to you. We've got a confidentiality agreement." I said, "Well, how did I manage to pull this off and everybody missed it?" He said, "Good question." He said, "Apparently, E. Howard Hunt, one of Gordon Liddy's partners in organizing all this criminal activity, was your front man." Hunt, however, had never heard of any of this, which made it a little bit more difficult, and the authors had never bothered to contact Hunt. I told St. Martin's Press if they published this, we would sue. We did. There was 9 years of litigation. St. Martin's spent, and the other defendants we named, Liddy and the others, they spent $15 million fighting our lawsuit. They realized we weren't going to go away, and by this time they had discovered that they were in deep trouble. The central source for this story is a man who's been in and out of mental institutions his entire adult life, a fellow by the name of Philip Mackin Bailey, who claimed that the call girl ring was operating in the DNC and that he was associated as both counsel and then maybe some management functions with this call girl operation. Bailey's call girl ring had not only my wife as a member of the call girl ring, but almost every attractive woman in Washington, from Diane Sawyer, who worked at the Nixon White House and later became the news person we know her today at ABC News, the treasurer of the re-election committee's wife, Deborah Sloan, who had been portrayed briefly in the movie All the President's Men. Any attractive woman was a part of this call girl ring that was operating in association with the Democratic headquarters. The call girl ring was purportedly operated at another apartment building nearby, the Columbia Plaza, but it's one of its chief branches was in the Democratic headquarters, where they would set up the dates for their visiting friends. I learned this from my then fiancée, later wife, Maureen, and this prompted me to order the Watergate break-in, and then to, not once but twice. The second time I went in looking for some information about people who had information on Maureen, and there allegedly being photographs of her in a see-through 90 with other prostitutes in the Democratic headquarters. As we proceeded with the lawsuit and we proceeded with our discovery, and began talking to the people involved, we found, first of all, there was no call girl ring. Philip Bailey, who was an attorney, I had first heard of when a team from the U.S. Attorney's Office came to my office in the White House to tell me in 1972, in June of 1972, I think the date was June 7th, that they were about to indict Philip Bailey because he had been extorting women into prostitution. And what he did is he went around the bars in Georgetown and would look for women whose relationship had gone on the bad side with their boyfriends. He was an attractive and funny and engaging person, and he would, in essence, seduce these ladies and then start a relationship with them. He would get them to his apartment. He would get them high on dope and wine and photograph them in very compromising pictures that he said he wanted so he could have them for himself. And then he would take the pictures and tell the women that if they didn't have sex with this person, this man, that he would expose their pictures. I mean, it was just an awful situation. And the reason the prosecutors had come to my office is that a young female attorney at the White House, who they thought was either in the counsel's office or somewhere on the president's staff, had been one of the victims of Bailey. What happened is Bailey had been turned in by a co-ed from the University of Maryland who just said, hey, this just isn't right. And so the police had gotten into it, and Bailey's whole practice had been driving the local U.S. Attorney's Office crazy because he represented on a pro bono basis or on court assignment basis a lot of prostitutes. And he wasn't a very good attorney apparently, but enough to drive them crazy. So they were delighted to find him on the wrong side of the law to deal with him. And they told me they were going to indict him. I said, please do. That was the last I heard of Philip Bailey until he surfaced in this book, Silent Coup, where they recast the story that I had phoned the prosecutors, had them come over to my office to find out if my fiance's name was in Bailey's book, and that it was allegedly in there under the name of Clout and her maiden name. And this was just stuff that was invented by Bailey. It was concocted by others. And as we went through the tapes and what have you, and I should qualify that, the author, Len Kolodny, had secretly and illegally in Florida recorded everybody he'd been associated with in concocting this book, including Bailey. But the most amazing thing about Bailey, being an attorney, he called my attorneys here in Los Angeles, able team that we assembled, and he informed them that he was going to represent himself. He was familiar with the civil procedure, and while he hadn't practiced in a while, he was going to handle his case himself, and that, but he thought he ought to tell these, my attorneys, that he actually was a space captain from Alpha Centauri, and he had been abandoned, and that someday he hoped to go home. We soon learned that Mr. Bailey had been in and out of mental institutions his entire adult life. He had confessed at one point to being the Green River serial killer up in Seattle or in Washington, wherever that happened, who they just recently found that serial killer. And he did that when they found him stark naked in the middle of a highway up there, and he admitted that he actually was the serial killer. When we got around to deposing Mr. Bailey, he asked that his current psychiatrist, because he was terrified of being deposed, and his psychiatrist reported, who had been treating him for some years at that point, said that Philip Bailey cannot distinguish fact from fiction, that he doesn't have a clue what the difference is. He has a bipolar condition that has been present since about the mid-70s, when Kolodny started relying on him for this information and that he has invented and what have you. This was not exactly the best source to rewrite the history of Watergate, somebody who's with these deep mental problems. At one point, being very aware of these deep problems, and I report a lot of these in the book, in the afterword of the book, being aware of these problems, Gordon Liddy, who was working with Kolodny and who has hated me ever since I threw cold water on his plans to have this elaborate intelligence gathering operation he concocted, and even hated me more for deciding that it was time to tell the truth about Watergate and not, and I totally reject his feeling that former members of the White House, for example, should adopt the code of the mafia when they make mistakes. So he joined in to try to see, as several of my former colleagues did, how they could use this to hurt me, and he helped Kolodny construct the story. Then he went out as another St. Martin's author and helped promote the book Silent Coup. And we sued him as well. He was one of the defendants. What we found out is that at one point, Liddy went to meet with Philip Bailey and decided, guy's perfectly sane as far as I'm concerned. Well, I can personally understand now, having watched Gordon Liddy over the years, that Liddy and Bailey could probably communicate on a very similar wavelength. And so I'm not surprised he had no problem with Bailey's assessment of facts. To make that story short, we ultimately did settle the case. This was not a case that St. Martin's could have wanted to go to trial. It kind of fizzled out at the end. We had sued Liddy as well, and Liddy and Kolodny did not want to settle, and I discuss all that in the book. But what happened, and the only reason we were willing to settle, is that in those many years, I picked up more information about Watergate than I'd ever had when I lived through it. I'd never read my colleagues' memoirs, for example. I'd really not studied it, I'd really not looked at it. But as a result of this lawsuit, I got into it in a way I would have never otherwise gotten into it. And I know more today about it than I have ever known. And I decided one of the most important things that's come out of that, and that was why it was time to reissue Blind Ambition. And I decided, while there's some minor little things in the story that I might have phrased differently based on my testimony and what have you, I decided this was the way I remembered it at the time, so I'm not going to change anything. I added some footnotes along the way to the original book, but I didn't change anything, because I think the story holds. I have found corroboration. Certainly the major theme of Watergate hasn't changed at all. There are a group of revisionists, however, who are hell-bent on rewriting this history. They are Nixon apologists, or they're just pure profit makers, and they're out to retell this story. And so for that reason, and the fact I had learned more, it was time to put this book back out and occasionally go out and talk about these subjects, because there are now several generations for whom this is the deepest of history. And I'm one who happens to believe that when we forget our history or ignore our history, we so easily repeat it. To digress for just a second, to pick up the theme I opened up with and the question I didn't answer about Sanford, is another very good example of somebody who seems to be ignoring history. I was struck that he didn't do, Sanford hasn't done with his emails, what the Harding family did with theirs. Not that it would change the story, not that it would change the fact, but those emails being out there, those love letters, have got to have tremendous hurt on his children and his family, the children of his lover. And to spread those out on the public record, I think, is highly damaging. And he had a copyright interest, as I explained in today's column on FindLaw, that he could have very easily invoked, that he has obviously chosen not to. He could have enjoined them, and they could have been characterized and put out in a less brutal form than they are now. To me, a typical example of not learning anything from our history. History never repeats itself exactly, but the patterns are certainly similar. And what I found myself when I turned to writing books doing totally surprised me. That I once thought that the lessons of Watergate would last certainly throughout my lifetime. But yet I found myself writing books when I turned to writing, when I turned 60, about Bush and Cheney. The first one being the book Worse Than Watergate. And I think that the bottom line on that is that as tough and as hard-nosed and as dark as Richard Nixon could be at times, I can't believe he would have ever taken this country into torture under the worst of circumstances. There are arguments pro and con. I can't find any of the arguments for it that can really stand the test. I don't think Richard Nixon ever would have employed that. What happened is much worse, and much of what happened in Watergate, as I explain in this Afterword, has been forgotten, had pure national security roots that had occurred under Bush and Cheney. They would have toughed it out as a national security matter. So these things kind of conflate as well and seem to me to be suddenly very timely again. So with those general opening remarks, if you all have any questions, or if any of your other offices have any questions that they want to send in, I'd be happy to try to answer them while we're visiting here. Yes? Is this fresh water here, Julie? Do you know?
I'll get you some.
Great. A little whistle water.
There are a lot of things I would like to ask you, but two of them come to mind that I've thought about for a long time if I ever had the opportunity. How do you think history should remember Richard Nixon, and what do you feel Kissinger's remembrance should be?
Good questions, and history is still sorting that out. I recently, I don't know if any of you read in the press, spoke at the Nixon Library. Anybody aware of that? Several of you are. It caused quite a storm. Apparently it was almost like a near-death experience for the people at the Nixon Foundation for me to come down there and talk. The Nixon Foundation originally started the library. They tried to keep it operating. They had no papers in it from Nixon because they were all back in College Park, Maryland, as they had been acquired by the government in the aftermath of Watergate that was worried that Nixon was going to destroy the papers. So only recently has the National Archives taken over the operation as a presidential library of the Nixon Presidential Library. Over the years, I've spoken at almost all the presidential libraries, from Eisenhower to Kennedy to, I've used Johnson, we've never had an event there, but Kennedy and Carter, most recently Clinton. So I did an event not too long ago at the FDR's library. I love the library system. And thank you, Julie. I think it would be a shame to have that system politicized and somehow jeopardized. So they invited me down there on June 17th, which happens to be the 37th anniversary of the bungled Watergate break-in, and which is quite appropriate given the material I placed in the Afterword of the new reissue of Blind Ambition, where I have assembled an awful lot of new hard data based on documents and tapes that show that Richard Nixon and his staff wasn't quite as ignorant. While they weren't involved in ordering the Watergate break-in, what happened at the Watergate was the direct result of information that Nixon wanted, financial information about the Democrats, and I explained why they wanted it. But at the Nixon Library, I learned how hard the Nixon Foundation is trying to control Richard Nixon's legacy. I don't think they can. When we have a release like we had just earlier this week of more Nixon tapes, which Bob Woodward, the reporter who covered Watergate, has so aptly put, they are the gift that keep on giving when the tapes are released every few years. And stuff comes out that, you know, where Nixon, for example, is talking with aide Chuck Colson when the decision comes down in Roe v. Wade. And he says to Colson, he said, well, you know, I can understand circumstances where abortion is very important, particularly in interracial situations. Now, just, you're right, put your hand to your forehead. Here we have a president who is now in the Oval Office, who is the result of an interracial relationship. I mean, Nixon had the ability to say the wrong thing at the wrong time quite frequently. The anti-Semitism that runs throughout the tapes is always going to affect him. And apparently there's more of that hasn't all been surfaced out of this latest release that they will dig out. It takes time to record these tapes. They are very hard to hear. The only ones that are easy to hear are those that were done on the telephone. The ones that were done in the Oval Office are better. The ones that were done in what he called his hideaway office in the executive office building are the worst. The audio is the worst on those. Technology is improving the ability to listen to these tapes all the time. They're getting better. In fact, there's some in this current release that might not have been released earlier because there was nothing to be heard. What happens is they don't prepare transcripts of these when they release them because it's so difficult. It takes about this is based on my own experience, who did a book called The Rehnquist Choice, based on Nixon tapes. It takes between 8 and 15 hours to prepare, and many times more, to prepare 1 hour of Nixon tape. It's a very laborious, difficult, and often open to interpretation when you can't hear a word or not sure. I'm pretty good at it because I know the players and, you know, the way their conversations proceeded. So we don't have access to all those tapes. Anyway, to your question of how Nixon's going to be remembered, I think it'll always be through the lens of Watergate and his abuse of power. I don't think you can get away from that. I think he is a better president than where he is often ranked right now in that parlor game by historians to rank presidents. He did a lot of things that were good. He did some things that were great. The China initiative was very daring and very bold and has changed the way the world operates today, bringing China into the world community. There are other things, you know, in listening to the latest batch of tapes, or the parts I listened to, he's a highly progressive president by today's standards. He would not be acceptable to the current Republican Party. He's so far to the left. He started things like the Environmental Protection Agency. This would be something that today's Republicans wouldn't tolerate. So he's very progressive in many areas. He is a moderate Republican, and I think that with the one thing that is changing, and has certainly changed my view, is when I saw what followed with Bush and Cheney. They have made Nixon look much better than he did, no question. And so those sorts of things are going to affect our historical view because we're always comparing presidents one with the other. As far as Kissinger, you know, Kissinger was the ultimate national security Secretary of State professional staffer. I don't think he was necessarily any more Machiavellian than anybody else in that trade. He was highly learned. I've looked at sections, I've never been able to make it through his 3-volume work where he has written his own history. It is jam-packed with information. I've read parts of it. He's a very brilliant man. Henry and I didn't have a lot of dealings in the White House. I often would see him coming out of the Oval Office as I was going in, and he would say things like, "Well, John, I'm sure glad that's your headline and not mine today," things like that. But as I say, I had very little rapport with Henry. I had assignments from time to time. When the chief of staff, for example, said to me once, "John, Henry wants to give all of his papers to the Rockefeller Foundation. You go tell him they belong to Richard Nixon." And Henry said, "Well, yes, sir, if they belong to Mr. Nixon, I understand. That's where they'll go." Any question? Next question.
No,
yes,
no.
sir, right here.
I read the Robert Dallek book, Nixon and Kissinger, and there was a kind of a story in there about where like a couple of weeks before Nixon was elected in '68, that they were really, really close to a peace in the Paris peace talks, and that Nixon, through some back channel, derailed that because he didn't want Humphrey to get a boost in the end. He never had to get a boost. And according to that book, that is indeed true. What's your take on it?
Well, I know Bob Dallek. In fact, as you were talking, I was lifting up my iPhone because I have Dallek's book on the phone here right now, and it's in my queue to listen to. I'm something of a gym rat, and I love to listen to audios in the gym. So I haven't listened to it yet, but I was actually visiting with Bob when he was working on the book back at the National Archives. We talked a lot about how authors write books and how he did it and how I did it. Since it's an author's session, he's very much like I am. As you start writing as soon as you can start writing, and then go back and clean up and polish. A lot of authors study and read. And we were talking, actually, I had a young PhD with me at the time, and I thought this would be good for him to hear, because it's very typical of PhDs. They will do all their research, and then they'll start to write. It's deadly. You're so bored with the subject by the time you get around to writing. You know more than you really need to know to write. It's just, and for this reason, many PhD dissertations are never completed because of the fact they never get at the writing process. And most writers I know, particularly those who are highly prolific, start writing as quickly as you can get your hands around a subject, focus on, and get into that section. Anyway, so Bob Dallek is a very careful historian, and you can trust the material in there. He got access to a lot of documents, particularly the Kissinger phone conversations that he relied on heavily for that. So it's good history, and I'm told a very good read. Yes, sir.
So
Question about you.
I was about to ask a question, and that is, what did the White House staffers like Cheney and I guess Rumsfeld also was connected to the Nixon White House? What lesson did they take away from Watergate and from the Nixon administration that I guess they?
Well, you know, it's interesting that it's quite clear the lesson Cheney took away, and I suspect Rumsfeld too, is one, don't get caught, and if you get caught, tough it out, and three, throw it under the umbrella of national security. Cheney has had an agenda that we've seen ever since Watergate of trying to somehow enhance powers of the presidency that he felt somehow got depleted during Watergate. I disagree with that. I don't think the president lost any power as a result of Watergate. Congress began coming up to what is its normal constitutional status of actually doing something called oversight and investigation, which they've, as we saw during the Bush-Cheney years, for example, when they controlled the Congress, didn't do. The congressman for this area is one of the traditional old school congressmen, Henry Waxman, who really believes you need to be a constitutional co-equal. Most people, I started in Congress as elevating to the become the the Chief Minority Counsel of the House Judiciary Committee. So I love that institution, and I know how much Congress can do. I know what Congress can't do, and only an executive branch can do. But they both fulfill their true functions is very important. It saddens me what's happened to Congress, and it still isn't back up where it should be under Nancy Pelosi. I certainly hope her leadership and the leadership of the Democrats, who look like they're going to be in control for a number of years now, get it back up to the status where it can actually deal with an overpowerful executive branch. So I think the lesson that Cheney and Rumsfeld presumably took was the three I said. Don't get caught. If you do get caught, tough it out and throw it under national security, because that's what they did. And those are not very healthy lessons. Yes, sir. Do you need microphone? I guess you need microphones so people in other offices
Okay.
can hear.
Let's take the question from Mountain View, and then you'll be next.
Oh, hello, Mr. Dean. I'm Jay-Zap from Google in Mountain View. I remember it being a very exciting time as a young adult seeing the hearings, Barbara Jordan, Sam Ervin. One thing that bothered me a little bit was Sam Dash's questioning of John Ehrlichman. I thought that was not really well done. I was wondering if you might have a thought about how that might have been done better.
For those of you who are too young, and many in this audience probably don't have a clue who Sam Dash might have been, he was the chief counsel of the Senate Watergate Committee. John Ehrlichman was a Nixon aide, the top domestic advisor to Richard Nixon, and up to his eyeballs in Watergate. I haven't thought about that questioning. I'm never sure. I looked at it terribly closely. Ehrlichman is a very arrogant personality. I think the little bit I did see, I think showed Ehrlichman's arrogance, which I don't think helped him a great deal. You've got to understand, in any congressional investigation, questioning is very difficult when you have a hostile witness. First of all, counsel really can't, particularly in a televised interview, be beating up too badly on a witness and following up. It's more of a probing than a cross-examination. And I'm somebody who worked on Capitol Hill, was involved in interrogating witnesses, and it's very difficult because it's not, as I say, quite the same as in a civil or criminal situation. The second thing that is also akin to that, tends to be in trials, you know what the answer is, except it's often in the deposition stage when you're just fishing, what the answer is going to be. And so when you get a false answer, you know how to pin down the witness and back him around or make him into a consummate liar. The other thing you should understand, of course, with Ehrlichman's testimony is he would be indicted for perjury for the things he said during his appearance before the Senate Watergate Committee and answering Sam Dash's questions. So maybe Sam Dash did, in essence, do a good job. Does that help you?
Yes, thank you much.
Good. Yes.
As a former presidential counsel, what do you think of the efforts by some to criminally prosecute John Woo and others?
You know, I couldn't wish anybody to be prosecuted. These are pretty serious. War crimes are, to me, the most serious crimes I can think of. I can understand what Obama would like this to go away, so he's not confronted with the issue. If you recall, during the campaign, he said, you know, we got to deal with people who have broken the law. If this is policy, it's one thing. If it's just stupidity or, you know, pushing the envelope too far, we're going to deal with it accordingly. As he became more and more the front runner, he began saying, I think it's important we look forward rather than looking backward. He's taken that into the White House and then turned over to his Attorney General, Eric Holder, the question of whether or not to prosecute. I will be shocked if they prosecute. I think they do want it to go away. They think it will be divisive, that he has more important things like the economy, health care, the environment that he wants to deal with, rather than bring all this baggage in the past. The other thing is, and I've written a couple columns on this because I was stunned by the information, roughly 70% of the American people don't have any trouble with torture. This is very new. Pre-Bush Cheney, pre-9/11, people had zero tolerance for torture by this country. What I think is necessary is an entire re-education of the American people. Cheney's out there pushing this view that torture works. Well, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work any better than just a normal interrogation type situation where you can get the same information. But what it does is when you have the exceptional policy, it permeates an entire system. There is study after study in country after country that show this, that how it infects and poisons and damages, the whole process. You can't keep it in bounds. As we saw from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib, where it spread and became very ugly. And you know, I'm somebody who speaks all over the world, and it's very difficult to try to explain to foreigners a country that was just at the pinnacle of respect for not using these kinds of techniques to suddenly be using them when the rest of the world knows that they're not very good, and they're certainly not what this country used to stand for. So whether or not, as I say, I doubt he'll be prosecuted. Understand, however, there's he's confronting a very serious criminal case in San Francisco. A judge, he tried to get it dismissed. I read a 42-page opinion just the other day, and a judge appointed by no less than George Bush II made the ruling, throwing out every one of his arguments, state secrets, that this would affect national security, that there was no direct cause between his writing a torture opinion and this guy Padilla being actually tortured somewhere in a brig in South Carolina. The judge threw all those out and showed indeed it was all very possible, and so the case is going forward. It's going into the discovery stage. So he's not out from underneath the wool. And I guarantee you, John Yoo, along with people like David Addington, David Haynes, Dick Cheney, are not going to be visiting Spain anytime soon, where they're very actively pursuing this. Yeah, I guess you have the mic here.
You had mentioned during your introduction that in the 35 years that have passed since Watergate, your opinion in retrospect has been informed by the books you've read and some more information that became available since that time. Can you point to any particular things or sequence of things that changed your mind or transformed your opinion about what went on during that time?
I guess what might have changed my mind about details, not the big picture didn't change, certainly with Watergate. I'm somebody who has roughly a 4 to, depending on the size of the book, 6 book habit a week. We were talking at lunch about Kindle, which is to me like finding some new addiction, because you get an impulse for a book and I download it. Just at $9.99 I can handle it, and I find myself getting that instant gratification from my reading habit. So I would have a lot of trouble picking any one book. Maybe I had the luxury of being able to do an awful lot of reading in the last 30 years. Had I stayed in government or business, I might not have. Although when I was in business, I did a lot of reading as well. We're in a true information era. There is so much information today that is to me the biggest problem. What I do is I look for people whose judgment I can trust, whose work I know will be careful. As a writer myself, I feel my job is to get the best information, to test it, to provide who my sources are. I didn't do that in Blind Ambition, and I didn't do it when I rewrote it. Almost all my other books you'll find heavily footnoted for that very reason, particularly dealing with more contemporary issues, because I want to know people to know exactly where I get the material I get. The style of the dramatization that Taylor Branch and I did when we worked on this book, which I explain in the book, didn't lend itself to a lot of footnotes, although I did add a few that I hadn't had in the earlier editions. But what I think, just we know by the time we're 25 for sure, 20 for sure, maybe 18 for sure, the difference between right and wrong. While I might not have been trained as a criminal lawyer, I certainly smelled rot. And I think if I made one mistake while I was at that Nixon White House is I tried to leave in September of '71 when I was becoming uncomfortable with things I was seeing. My boss, the chief of staff, said, "John, you leave, you'll be burning your bridge. We will not be happy if you leave. Don't expect to deal with this White House from the outside." And in essence, intimidating me to stay and saying, the jobs are going to only get better when you when you do leave. He didn't mention making license plates somewhere might be what would be on that agenda. Although I technically never did go to jail, I was in the witness protection program. They were more concerned about keeping me alive than anything else. So I did 120 days under the custody of the U.S. Marshals. It turned out to be my punishment. So I can't put my finger on any one issue. Obviously, our views. I have my political views, interestingly. I always called myself a Goldwater conservative. I now realize being a Goldwater conservative is way to the left of center by today's standard. But that's primarily was just some fundamental issues that government can get too big, and I know government can't do everything. On most issues, I'm highly progressive and really can't understand, for example, and I've been very critical in my writings of the religious right. And that's just maturity and growing up and being able to see a larger picture, I think. Anybody I miss? I think we've answered, left you speechless, so I thank you all very much.